Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about Ferrari and how well they stacked up against those around them, so McLaren and Red Bull. We'll also talk about the drivers and where they stacked up against the drivers around them in the Drivers' Championship. Now, if you want to look up and find out where Oliver Behrman was stacking up against those around him, I suggest you go look at my Haas video as he drove two races for Haas instead of the one race for Ferrari. So he is included in that Stack Up video instead of the Ferrari Stack Up video. Until then, we will start digging into Ferrari and see some general stats. As you can see here, Ferrari ended up in the constructors standing in second place. As we know, McLaren was in first, and then Red Bull is in third. So that's where we're comparing those numbers. We had an average starting position of 6th place for Ferrari and an average finishing position of 4th. So they were gaining ground throughout each race on average, and were able to pull in for a few more points in that regard for them. They had a total of 4 DNFs divided between the two drivers. So if we break that down and we look at Carlos Sainz, he finished 5th in the driver's standing. He started on average on 6th place, right alongside the Ferrari average. And he finished in 4th place, again, right along the average of Ferrari in general. He had 3 of those DNFs for Ferrari. And you compare those against his teammate Charles Leclerc, who finished in 3rd for the driver's standing. His average starting position was ahead of his teammate in 5th place. And his average finishing position was right alongside him in 4th place. And he had 1 DNF. So if you can see here, Charles was a better qualifier than his teammate Carlos Sainz, but he couldn't really take advantage of that over his teammate and gain that extra ground on average. So his average finishing position was still in 4th alongside his teammate. So he wasn't able to really take advantage of that starting position, as that kind of evened out for those two drivers in the Ferrari standings. As we can look farther in, we can kind of get a little bit more detail on how the race by race went. Speaking of that race by race data, we will start off with the sprint races. So we can see here Charles Leclerc in blue and Carlos in red, comparing them in those 6 sprint races that we had this season. So we can see that Charles started off much better than Carlos, but ended up worse overall this season in those sprint races, kind of edging out, have that trend line going up, which is bad because that's where that finishing position was, where Carlos was starting off a little bit behind his teammate and then getting slightly better throughout the season in those sprint races. He had that really good sprint race in Circuit of the America, whereas Charles Leclerc had that bad sprint race in Austria that kind of set these standards and these trend lines in those positions, even though Charles had that really good sprint race as well in Miami. They kind of offset the Austria one. But anyway, you can get a kind of an idea of the two teammates in that Ferrari and where they stood on the sprint races and how they played out. So here we're digging in a little bit on Carlos Sainz, and so we're comparing him against George Russell and Oscar Piastri, those drivers that finished around him in that driver's standing. And so we have Carlos starting off the sprint races, again, better than the other two drivers, but ending up a little bit behind if you pull out that trend line. I think he ended up doing a little bit ahead of George Russell in general, but if you continue those sprint races through a little bit farther in on the season that we didn't have, George Russell may have overtaken him in those sprint races on average. You can see Oscar Piastri here having a little bit more wider swings in that, starting off a little bit behind Carlos, but having that really good race in Austria, but then countering it with the Circuit of the America race, which is bad, and then coming back fairly strong in Brazil and Qatar, ahead of Carlos in those finishing positions. Whereas George Russell started off way farther behind Carlos at the very beginning of the season and is working his way towards that goal, pretty much behind him. But you can treat that trend line. It looks like he was going to be able to gain that ground in those sprint races to go ahead of Carlos in those sprint race results. And here we're comparing Charles Leclerc against Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. who finished around him in the Drivers' Championship. So you see Charles Leclerc in red, who started off better than Oscar and Lando, so both of McLaren drivers, but ended up behind them overall in the sprint races. Where Lando started off in the middle and was able to constantly gain ground and be comparatively consistent, gaining that ground throughout this season in those sprint races. And Oscar starting behind his teammate and having those wider swings in that result, but kind of constantly have that same trend line along his teammate, gaining that ground, showing that progress of that McLaren throughout the season. Here you can see the two Ferrari drivers compared to each other in the GP races, so then you get a lot more races and so a lot more data going into this one. And you can see Charles Leclerc in blue here, starting off slightly behind his teammate Carlos in those first 3 races, but by that next 4 races, he was gaining ground on him. Now he had a couple of bad races in Austria and Great Britain, but was able to come back fairly strong in those next 4 or 5 races, getting ahead of his teammate quite handily, and kind of shows that in that trend line where he's getting better throughout the season. It was, even though it's slightly better in that trend line aspect of it, he was still getting better throughout the season, whereas teammate was fairly stable in that flat trend line throughout this GP season. Carlos was fairly, consistent and steady. Charles was able to gain that ground on him through those end, half of the season, gaining those little positions and getting that little bit of ahead of him, gaining those driver's positions and points that he needed to really solidify his driver's standing. And again, we're comparing Carlos Sainz against George Russell and Oscar Piastri in those same GP races over the season. And as you can see here, that Carlos started off fairly ahead of both of those drivers and ended up ahead of those drivers in that trend line aspect of it as well. Whereas Oscar Piastri was in the middle, but it was really coming on pretty steadily, had that nice trend line, getting slightly better throughout the season, doing fairly good job in that middle section, really overtaking both Carlos and George in that middle section, whereas he's tailing off a little bit at the end as well. And Carlos was able to really keep that momentum going there. And George kind of finishing off a little bit between the two on that first section, but in that really taking over at the end, kind of gaining that ground faster than Oscar Piastri was, and they can see that trend line getting better, that higher delta between the beginning and the end of the season for George, giving him that ground where he was able to start picking up some positions, keeping him in that running, for that driver's position, and really putting some pressure on Oscar and Carlos at the end of the season. But otherwise, it was fairly competitive for these 3 drivers throughout this season. As you can see, those tight groupings between the 3 drivers for most of the races in this season. And here we're comparing Charles Leclerc against Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris in those GP races. And you can see him in red here, doing better than both of those drivers at the very beginning of the season. But you can see Lando kind of overtaking him in that first 1/8 of that season, I guess. Really taking over and being really consistent through most of this season, but kind of ending up on a little bit of a backspin where he's having a couple of issues in Brazil through Qatar, but ending very strongly in Abu Dhabi as well. So that keeps him kind of going and keeping him in that driver's position. Whereas Charles Leclerc was fairly stable except for those couple of races at that very middle section. So we have him in, Spain, Austria, and Great Britain, where he was kind of off compared to the rest of his results. And that kind of hurt him in that trend line aspect as well, as that kind of, lightened that trend line a little bit more than it should have been, particularly if you eliminated those races in his, data collection. Whereas Oscar, was kind of on par with Lando for more than not, but he was kind of falling behind in that first section, had several offs on those races, not quite being that competitive with his teammate. And you can see those same kind of aspect along the same lines as Lando at the end, where he wasn't quite able to get that McLaren being competitive with that Ferrari at the end of the season as well. He was still doing fairly well and doing very consistent, and you can see pretty much Oscar and Charles gaining ground throughout the season, whereas Lando Norris was fairly stable throughout this season, maybe gaining just a tad if you kind of compare those markers from the very beginning to the very end. That kind of shows you the aspects in the development of the cars and the drivers getting familiar with those vehicles throughout the season and kind of where they play out in regards to each race. And here we're looking at the teams in general as a whole. So we're comparing McLaren against Ferrari and Red Bull. And so you can see Ferrari in red here. So if you see Red Bull, they had a really beginning of the season really strong. And then after that first third or so, they kind of tailed off and were kind of consistent, but they kind of tailed off for the rest of the season. Where Ferrari had a very strong start of the season, fell off in that middle section, and then came back at the very end, gaining a lot more points at the very end of the season as well. So if they can put their middle, that season together and get a little bit more consistent with the beginning and the end, they probably would have been, constructors champions. But unfortunately, they dropped off there comparative to the other two teams, where McLaren, was that first third was okay, but then they really gained ground after that first third and were a little bit more consistent throughout the rest of the season. So kind of opposite to what Red Bull was. And if you look at those trend lines, you can see that Red Bull was going down, which is bad in this case because this is the points that you're gaining, per race over the season. Whereas McLaren and Ferrari were gaining ground, so that's both good, both of their drives. But McLaren was a little bit higher in that regard than Ferrari, so they ended up overtaking Ferrari in regards to that, point-wise. And that constructor's standing, as we know. You can kind of get an idea of how many points and how well the teams did per race. And here we see the same data. We're just in a step graph format. So this is kind of showing you, better comparison between the three teams on where they lined up and where they overtook each other. So you can see that Red Bull started off strong. Ferrari kind of was a little bit more pressure on Red Bull at the very beginning, but then tailed off in that middle section and then gained some ground. Was able to overtake Red Bull by the end of the season, but not quite be on that true competitive ground with McLaren. Whereas McLaren started off behind the two other constructors at the very beginning, but by that midpoint was able to overtake Ferrari. And then, of course, by Azerbaijan, Singapore range, they were able to overtake Red Bull as well and stay in that lead, even though Ferrari kind of came up behind them, in that regard, putting a little bit more pressure on McLaren by the end of the season, keeping them, on their toes till the very end. So what's coming up next is my, stack up video for McLaren, and it'll be my last stack up video for the 2024 season as they were the constructors champions. And after that, I will try to probably get into, hopefully, my predictions for 2025 before the beginning of this season. So watch out for that. And until then, I will see you on the grid.